Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's quite funny. I hold this talk here at almost every DLD, and I never got so much reaction before a panel, Bharat, I have to tell you. At least 20 people ask me about the future of media. What are you talking about? And I think it has to do what Dr. Burda always says, if media changes, society changes. And we can clearly see this around the world, how important it is to talk about the future of media. And we're chatting since yesterday whether Facebook is a media company or not, what you can do. We will come to that a few seconds later. You wrote the book, The Content Trap. I have to ask you, who has not read this book? Lots of potentials. I just can tell you personally that there are two important books if you are in media and tech. One is, from my perspective, your colleague, Creighton Christensen, who wrote Innovative Dilemma, which is a fantastic book, who made it clear why Facebook and other companies were able to grow and to be more successful today than Microsoft on certain things, communication for IE. And it's a content trap, and everyone who hasn't read should read it. It's one of the top 10 books by the Fast Company and Bloomberg. And how would you describe the content trap in a minute, that the people who don't know it get an insight?
Yeah, no, thank you, Stefan. It's a pleasure to join you here. And let me be clear, the panel is titled The Future of Media. That's not what the book is about. So one of the things I try and argue in the book is we're very bad at making predictions. And so one of the things I tried to do was avoid any speculation about the future. This is really a book about history and strategy. And in some sense, just think of the following. In 1994, if we were writing a book about what's going to happen, we had no idea. And more interestingly, there was no history to rely on. That was really the premise of the book, which is now we have a 25-year history. And so what have we learned that might inform how we think about the future? So there's really three key ideas, if you will. One, which was mentioned by Francisca. Just start with the proposition that everyone, metaphorically, is a media company. All of us, all of you, we're all producing content every single day, and we can share it with anyone, anywhere in the world. Second, the implication of that directly is that more content and better content need not win. And that's something we've also seen play out. The third is if we actually enlarge the scope of the conversation to think beyond traditional media companies, and not just content versus distribution, but what I call the connectors. Content companies are on the wrong end of that battle against the connectors, and that has huge implications for many discussions. So those are, in some sense, the three messages. If you want to take it a step further, a lot of people interpret the book as saying content is not king. I have not used that phrase anywhere in the book. But if you ask me about my view on that topic, I'm happy to smash that myth as well. So.
I think we discussed a bit what would be most interested for you. And I have a few slides just to show you, to understand where we're standing. Would you please switch on the presentation? I'm using a few charts of Michael Wolff, who has been a speaker here for several times, who has been Global Managing Director of McKinsey for many years on media and tech out of New York. And he's publishing a fantastic report, I think, what's happening in media and technology every year. And it's quite amazing that it's clear that the time spent using media by US adults is only slowing. When I saw the number that the average American today consumes 5 hours of video every day. These are enormous numbers, but it's very clear it doesn't go up anymore. People have to sleep and have to work. Now, seeing growth in digital, growth rates if we look on time spent of the customers, they're coming down. We had 15% growth on digital. That is now only 2%. And the question is, what's happening with TV? We talk about that in video in a few minutes. Because TV has been pretty stable, if we see the number, for a long time in America. And the question is, what's happening now in a different environment? Because we got a bunch of new people in the room. Scott Galloway this morning talked about the horsemen, and it's probably very fair to say that Netflix and YouTube are big horsemen if it comes on time spending. And they're attacking existent players which today provide a lot of minutes to the audience, like traditional TV stations, Facebook, but also new content producers. And if you see the growth numbers of the new video platforms, here in Germany, especially Amazon Prime Video, if you talk to the Amazon guys here in Germany, they just say it's exploding. Minutes spent on the platform. I think it's fair to say even Sky in Germany is trying to defend the position, but to have it included in your Amazon Prime subscription is a huge competitive advantage. So the question is, who will win? and that is a question we will look into in a few seconds. What is the best way you think, after you studied all the media companies, to win that battle for attention? What would be your advice? Actually, you're in the strategy unit of Harvard Business School. You talk to many CEOs of media companies, both in America and here in Europe, as we discussed before. What is your advice you give them if they ask you, how can we win the battle for attention?
It's a great question, Stefan. I think, let me start with what I think will not win. What I don't think will win is more marketing. Because, again, as we said, there's simply content clutter. Everyone's spending more dollars. It's a bit like the old story about movies. You know, if I spend $20 million promoting a movie, all the other studios are going to follow suit. So all we're doing is simply spending more money to get the same attention. I think if you look back, there's at least 3 different ways that companies are trying to solve this problem, and not just within media, but beyond media. Before I get to the 3, one thing I'll just say is, a lot of people say, oh, the way to get attention is by shouting louder or shouting something more sensational. And that's clearly something we've seen play out in different sectors, including politics, by the way. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. So sensationalism is clearly one approach. The 3 that I find interesting are, they go back to this idea of connections. So if we just step back and ask the question, what was the impact of digital on not just media, virtually any product? There's at least 3 different kinds of impacts. One, let's say all of us, all of you produce stuff, content, lectures, education, advertising, cars, in something we might call a hub, okay? That's what companies are. They're hub and spoke organizations. We sell to consumers in the spokes. Well, the first impact of digital was we can dramatically increase the number of spokes. We can go from 1,000 to 1 million, almost instantaneously. That's what we call reach, free distribution, and so on and so forth. The second impact is when we realize it's not just hub to spoke. We can get the spokes to talk back to the hub, to actually produce stuff. That's all about users producing stuff, users telling us what they like, don't like. This is about interactivity, personalization, data. But the third benefit is something even beyond these. When we realize it's not hub to spoke or spoke to hub, it's spoke to spoke. And the moment I say this, it seems so blindingly obvious. And I would argue 90% of companies just miss that. We miss the spoke-to-spoke idea. Now, why is that interesting? So Scott Cook at Intuit recently told me, he said the best marketing strategy is when you spend $0 on marketing.
Because you have the word of mouth,
because
you have interaction with your users,
the network, right?
Which is supporting.
I mean, if we just think about how much money Microsoft and Facebook have spent advertising their products, it's almost nothing, right? Once we have the network, the customers become our sales force. And so this is all about co-creation and communities and so on and so forth. I mean, Dominic is here. He started a company based on this idea. The second idea is something that goes back in TV, and in fact in media a lot, which I call piggybacking. What is the idea? We basically use big properties to showcase other properties. By the way, we see this everywhere. We saw this in TV. If you watched a program, you'd basically watch the next program just out of habit. Dan Brown, I don't know if anyone's read The Da Vinci Code. That was his 4th book. The 4th book, the moment it came out, actually promoted the previous 3 books, which had gone nowhere. We see this in music. We see this everywhere, right? You look at YouTube artists. Part of the reason we're doing things like covers is we're piggybacking on names or brand name artists.
Sure.
So that's the strategy of piggybacking. The third strategy is what I would call compliments, which is, let's go back and think about what happened to the music industry. And in some sense, this speaks to the question of TV. Everyone looked at CDs and said, this is what's happening to CDs. The music industry is dead. It turns out now that we look back, there was massive amounts of value created in the industry.
But
not in CDs.
Not in CDs.
Not just in digital formats, but through complementary products. Things like demand for broadband access. Things like
concerts.
Demand for concerts. What is that concert equivalent when we think about any product? By the way, a month ago, we were holidaying. I was with my daughter. This was in Dubai. I don't know if anyone's been to this place called Atlantis. You can go and swim with the dolphins. So I went, and the price was pretty cheap. So we went, and we spent a few hours swimming with the dolphins. Had an amazing experience. When we came out, they showed us photos that they had taken of me and my daughter. Roughly $50 a photo.
Easy.
And I will admit it, I bought that photo. In fact, I bought multiple photos. It's not just selling the content, it's like, what are the compliments we can think about?
Let's talk about one of the major industries which is getting disrupted at the moment, the TV and cable business in America.
Yeah.
I mean, the cord cutting is accelerating. If we look at the numbers in North America, free advertising is falling between 3 and 5%. The advertising revenues are falling. WPP shooted out a profit warning before Christmas. Stock came down. We see that Google TV is coming. Robert, who is here from YouTube, he's the CBO, the Chief Business Officer of YouTube, showed us products which are just enormous, what you can do with your smartphone. Instead of paying $100 for cable, you pay $30 to Google, and you have almost same feature plus much more than you had in the past. What is your view on the traditional TV networks, both on the free viewer side and subscription businesses? Share they the same fate as newspapers? Are they now coming down and will have a terrible time?
Yeah. I mean, if I look at that question from the perspective of cord cutting, as we call it, which is, are we going to pay to watch cable TV, and therefore the traditional TV networks? That is not going up, right? If anything, that's going to be accelerating downwards. But that's a bit like the CD question, right? If I define the problem as what happens to CDs, of course they're going to suffer. No matter how smart we are as managers, there's nothing you can do about it.
So what do you give them as advice? If you talk to CBS or others, how to rescue the billions and billions?
Yeah, and in fact, this goes back to the data you were showing, Stefan, which is just as we look at cord cutting and we say video consumption on TV is going down, video consumption, the aggregate is going up. As a consumer, my daughter and friends her age do not think about pay TV as their source of video. They think about video. They think about video everywhere. And so the amount of video being consumed is actually going up. It's simply a question of how do we define our business. If I define my business as content allied with the distributors, there's nothing I can do. If I look at it and say, my strength is content and I can distribute it anywhere, oh my gosh, there's so many possibilities.
That means you have to change your whole business strategy in the future compared to past.
Right.
There's one company which has also been named as a company who might be able to be successful, that's Disney.
Yeah.
And Disney recently announced that they will step out of Netflix and that they will start, they acquired Hulu, they have a lot of reach, they have great brands. Probably it's very fair to say that Disney is a company that protects their brands massively. Is it too late for them?
No, so what's happening in streaming video over the last year is more exciting than at any time. I mean, finally we have competition to Netflix, potentially, right? And it's not just Disney, right? As you mentioned, it's Amazon Prime, it's Hulu, it's all the other players coming in. So my view on this is that there's two ways to look at it. One is they're finally saying, look, this is the last moment where we can stop this train. Let's see if we can take our content back and create our own streaming service and so on and so forth, or at least be able to bargain, able to negotiate better with these kinds of players. I think that's a pretty narrow view. One question we might ask is, why is Disney one of the first major content companies to pull its content off Netflix? And I think the moment you frame it that way, I mean, what is the reason, what do we associate Disney with, right? It's not the Disney Channel. It's not ABC, it's not ESPN, it's the theme parks. That was the experience we got from Disney. Now, the moment you take the experience of that company and you reduce it to streaming video, you have taken what we might call an experience company and made it a content company. In a sense, the way I interpret their move is we're trying to pull this back and say, we're not just content that's available through streaming, we're an experience company. If we can integrate a streaming app with the experience we have in all our other assets, that's potentially exciting.
I mean, if you guess, I know it's very hard to predict sometimes, in 5 years' time, Disney will be successful with that strategy? Do you think they're able now, in 2019, we talk about 15 years of Netflix down the road, we talk about 120 million subscriber last quarter, still chance to make it?
So in theory, yes.
In theory?
Yes. The big question is, I mean, I just constructed a story for how I might want to run the Disney app. I don't know if that's the way they're thinking about it. I think the big question here is going to be execution, obviously. The Fox acquisition gives them a lot more assets to put on their streaming services. But this is a big company. And we can talk about this later on. But if you ask me what are the biggest assets that these companies have, it's not content assets. The biggest asset that I think is going to make these companies successful or not is going to be culture.
Is culture. The culture in the company?
Yeah. I mean, being able to move and being able to move at a speed which is in line with what's happening.
So you rather talk about change management. You would say the change management ability of the management team to rapidly change the company, not going the other way around, what they have done in the past, could be the key success factor.
Yeah, there's a theory, there's an idea that I heard from this company called Schibsted. I don't know if you've heard about it. This is a Norwegian media company. It's one of the most successful to make the transition to the digital world. They use this phrase, forget and borrow, which has actually influenced my thinking. When we launch new ventures or when we launch new projects, what really determines success is being able not just to borrow from the parent, but being able to forget many things in the parent. There are so many things we create as habits, as routines, as processes. Most companies are not able to forget.
Can I ask you a nasty question after you said that? Have most media companies bad management?
I don't think it's bad management. So let me put it another way.
Not able to change fast enough?
Yeah, I think
in the US, is that the reason?
I think, Stefan, it's very easy to celebrate entrepreneurs. It's very easy to celebrate digital startups. Just look what happened to Netflix 4 or 5 years ago when they went from DVDs to streaming. They actually had a legacy business which they struggled to manage. They lost 80% of their market value. If we look at what's happened to some of the digital giants, there's very few that have actually managed to reinvent themselves. I mean, you take Amazon, you take Facebook. But one of the things I often like to tell my students is the real test for entrepreneurs is not being able to come up with that great idea. It's what happens when you have to kill that great idea. It's when you grow up. That's the test of whether they are actually smarter, or in fact, this was simply a question of you had no legacy business. So I'm not sure it's just management. It's incentive, it's cannibalization, it's
the willingness
and these
to
are hard
change
issues.
fast and to make hard decisions on your
we
products
created a digital learning
services.
initiative at Harvard Business School, and one of the things we keep discussing is we don't need to pat ourselves on the back saying that we came up with this idea. The hardest thing is making sure we can maintain this.
Okay. Let's talk about Google and Facebook for a few minutes, because they are the two big giants. Content with YouTube. There are some rumors in the room who say that YouTube still today is massively subsidized by the money they make out of the search monopoly. And Facebook is probably something going forward and backwards. If you look at their quarterly results, video is a core topic. If you look at the advertising spend, we heard it here all over, they probably take something between 80 to 100% of all new advertising coming into digital. Numbers rise, but these are the facts we see on the table. Is this something you see in the future, or is there something in the advertising game being changed that new incumbents come and change something new?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me throw out a few observations. The first is, we talk about the digital duopoly, which is 85% of all ad dollars going to Google and Facebook. And a lot of people say, oh, let's start a third company or a fourth company to compete with them. I don't think that will work unless you understand the dynamics of what gave rise to the digital duopoly. This is not simply that they are bigger or they have more data. They actually enjoy network effects. The moment you enjoy network effects, the idea is once I'm ahead, I get further and further and further ahead. This was Microsoft versus Apple 30 years ago. It doesn't matter if we come up with a better product. Once they have the network, that's a machine just rolling down.
Very hard to crack down.
So in some sense, the marketing question is linked to the product question. Now, having said that, my own view, coming back to what we discussed earlier, is I think one of the biggest traps that we fall into is thinking, or this idea, that advertising was all about reach. Right? Think about the metrics we used. We used metrics like eyeballs. They've essentially reduced all of us to our eyeballs. I mean, that is one of the biggest crimes against humanity. And what does that mean? It leads us down a path where we start bombarding, where we start getting all these irritating pop-ups in front of us. By the way, there's a separate question of whether digital advertising is effective, and there's some studies actually questioning that. But I would argue that the future of advertising, if you're going to argue about the basis of reach as being your strength, only the companies with the biggest reach can win. That is not a strategy or a recipe for most of us to win. It has to be something around engagement. And what does that mean? Again, it goes back to this idea of co-creation, networks, engagement. So that's one set of issues. The second is, I think we're actually seeing what might be called an inversion in the media industry, where traditionally we wanted to advertise, we went to ad agencies, we created ad copy, we bought media and media publishers or channels, and we advertised. One of the things that's interesting now, going back to this premise that everyone's a media company, take someone like Tom Brady. I don't know if anyone's heard of Tom Brady. By the way, he is the biggest and most important sporting athlete today in the world. I apologize for saying that. If anyone saw the game last night, it just underscores that. Tom Brady is a media company. He's like Messi and Ronaldo and Federer, where essentially he puts a picture of his refrigerator with his cat in the refrigerator. There's some Greek yogurt bars lying in the refrigerator, which just happen to be part of the picture. The next day, that Greek yogurt retailer said his website crashed. Suddenly, they realize, oh my gosh, this is not just putting a picture. We're a media company. We can actually monetize that. And so you now have companies going directly to influencers, where we say we can reach more eyeballs at 1/3 the cost in 1/10 of the time.
Actually,
that's actually quite interesting when you start thinking about marketing.
I mean, that drives me to the next question, something which is now discussed very intensively globally, also here on DLD is a question, is Facebook a media company? Do we have sound from my, I just have to, do we have sound, gentlemen? We have sound. So I just would like to share, I would like to take the last 5 minutes to show you something. This is a 90
seconds video. So I want to understand why no one seems to have caught on to the Russian effort earlier. Mr. Stretch, how did Facebook, which prides itself on being able to process billions of data points and instantly transform them into personal connections for its user, somehow not make the connection that electoral ads paid for in rubles were coming from Russia? Those are two data points. American political ads and Russian money, rubles. How could you not connect those two dots?
Senator, you mentioned one aspect of the Russian threat that was so visible in 2016, which was the question of account compromise, stealing contents, and disseminating them. And that's a threat our security team was intensely focused on, and we think effectively addressed. I think in hindsight, we should have had a broader lens. There were signals we missed, and we are now focused.
People are buying ads on your platform with rubles. They're political ads. You put billions of data points together all the time. That's what I hear that these platforms do. They're the most sophisticated things invented by man ever. Google has all knowledge that man has ever developed. You can't put together rubles with a political ad and go like, those two data points spell out something bad.
Okay. Actually, I have to tell you that story, Bharat. I usually do 2 panels here, but Facebook rejected that I would interview here Elliot on the stage. Anyway.
I can see why.
Sorry, but coming back to the question. I mean, we talk about that media company are a source of trust what they do. We both discussed how safe is the world now with the Trump administration in America. We do not go into politics, but there are now 2 challenges. The first challenge is how do we get real, authentic content to people? And the second question is the advertising question. What is your perspective when you talk about influences? Isn't there a reason for a classic media company who is able to control this kind of content on both sides to exist and to make great businesses out of it?
How much time do we have? So it's a big question. So let me just offer some thoughts which perhaps are part of the general conversation most of us have had around this, and then maybe some other observations which might be a little different. So the first is, I often hear these 3 questions rolled into one. A, is Facebook a media company? B, should it be regulated as such? And C, should they take responsibility for what they have on their platform? Those are actually 3 separate questions. If I start with the latter, should companies take responsibility for what they offer? The answer is absolutely. Now, in some sense, what that video shows, I think, gets to something quite fundamental, which is if there was anything which affected the business model as opposed to just information or content, the companies would be trying to address that fraud instantaneously, right? So if we think about advertising fraud versus content fraud, there's simply different incentives built into the system.
Absolutely.
There's no reason it should be from a societal point of view, but that's just the reality. If you step back and you ask the question, what has been the impact of fake news? One of the things I just want to throw out is there's a supply side argument to this debate, and there's a demand-side argument. The supply-side argument says there is increasingly massive amounts of fake news, which means unverifiably false information, being distributed through some of these platforms. And that, we have all the data.
In America and
Everywhere.
Germany, we had, in the week before the election, both in America and in Germany, 6 out of 10 pages read about Angela Merkel or Hillary Clinton have been fake news.
Yeah. And part of the reason we take this seriously is A, the volume, and B, because it's verifiably false information. What I'd love to do is broaden the debate to also not just think about the responsibility of companies in impacting the supply of such content, but think about what's happening on the demand side. And here things start getting pretty sobering pretty quickly. What do I mean by that? There have been a lot of studies which show if you and I look at the same piece of content, we interpret it differently. This has nothing to do with information being true or false. it has much more to do with beliefs. Let's run the counterfactual, which is supposing tomorrow we could wave a magic wand and get rid of fake news completely. Would the question of trust disappear? And my submission is the answer is no. Which is we already have the issue, which is we tune into the media channels which we want to hear. We've had that problem now for 30 years or more. One of the things that's fascinating to me is when some media channels start saying, we're not in the media business, we're in the opinion business. Right? Maybe it's not just time for the platforms to take responsibility, it's time for us to take responsibility as media companies and as individuals. This is the much harder problem. And finally, if we broaden the debate to actually think about, we said let's not talk about politics, political leaders. One of the big question marks is when verifiably false information is being distributed by our leaders, what is the responsibility there?
Absolutely.
To actually affect what we produce. So if we're going to talk about responsibility, I think the debate needs to be broadened. By the way, it's not a coincidence, again, going back to what we were discussing, that trust levels in many of these institutions were at an all-time low before fake news and Facebook. So the question is, what is going on, right? If we're going to talk about fake news on these platforms, we've got to actually encompass the debate to think about responsibility much more broadly.
Absolutely. Bharat, thank you very much. Time is up.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your
not at all.
contribution. It was
Thanks so
great
much.
that you have
Thank
me
you.
here.